When I was a kid, I absorbed perhaps more horror movies than I healthily should have. I'm not sure what the gauge of that is. Yeah, I had seen every A Nightmare on Elm Street movie by the time I was 10, but I have yet to murder anyone in their dreams. I am not terribly desensitized to violence. I find shock and horror at real-world brutality, and there are even many depictions of fictionalized violence that I don't think is appropriate. So perhaps I was just a kid watching horror movies, and that's okay. Having been exposed to that many scary movies, there were a few things I was able to parse out at even that young an age. First of all, that there was a huge difference between a horror movie and a scary movie. Scary movies, Psycho, Night of the Living Dead, they usually involved a general atmosphere that made me uncomfortable, but in a good way. The monsters were less cartoony, and even in the circumstances that seemed otherworldly, an alien invasion or a zombie plague, there just seemed to be more of a likelihood of the events in a scary movie coming to pass, both to me and to those I loved. The horror movies, though, those were the ones that involved the over-the-top bad guys and tacked-on morality themes. They were either so fully aware of their lack of serious content that they played the entire genre for subconscious laughs amid the splatters of blood, or they were so diluted that they came across even funnier while attempting to be overly dramatic and moody. These movies held a special place in my heart, and primary among them was the Friday the 13th movies. For me, they beckoned back to a time before the world had placed its mark on me, before cynicism in society had impressed upon me the worth of being liked. Just me and my friends, laying on a living room floor in sleeping bags, watching these movies, likely after our parents had already gone to sleep. I was still innocent, just like Jason. Now there is arguably no greater or more famous face of the slasher genre than Jason Voorhees. A case could certainly be made for Freddy Krueger or Michael Myers, but both of those creatures owe their inception to visionary filmmakers and films that were experimenting with the horror motif. They were not born of the same trash heap that Jason was. They only clung to it out of desperation in their later movies to perpetuate notoriety and continuing sequels. Freddy Krueger only became a pop culture icon, complete with a Will Smith rap song and trading card series, years after Wes Craven had crafted a brilliant story of a new monster that could murder you at your most helpless, in your sleep. And no sane man can argue that auteur John Carpenter created a truly scary movie with the tense and atmospheric original Halloween. Friday the 13th, though, that movie started as essentially trash. Once again, in a good way. An excuse to showcase violence, nudity, youthful frivolity, and try to sledgehammer in a story about a mother's revenge for her drowned child. Therein lied my fascination with Friday the 13th. The first movie introduces us to mostly just Jason's mother, Pamela. Her friendless son, who was born with an unspecified mental and physical handicap, drowns as a child at Camp Crystal Lake due to the negligence of the counselors. After a murder spree that would make any homicidal maniac proud, Pamela meets her makers at the hands of some of those same counselors, and her son later takes up the mantle of Crystal Lake Killer. Now, Jason's backstory has him believing to be drowned when he was 10 years old. In reality, Jason survived his drowning and essentially lived in the woods for a decade, where he eventually witnessed the murder of his mother. In Friday the 13th Part 2, the main character, Ginny, a child psychology major, ponders the question of Jason. She wonders, is he some kind of out-of-control psychopath, or a child trapped in a man's body? She states that he probably doesn't even know what death really is. He had no friends, no relationships, really. His first experience with anything like death was witnessing his mother's murder at the hands of wicked teenagers. To Jason, his mother was just doing what she always did, protecting her son. So we are left with the idea that instead of an unstoppable killing machine, constantly resurrected from the dead by supernatural means, we have Jason Voorhees, a slowly lumbering woodsman with the disabled mind of a handicapped 10-year-old boy. This is what Jason was early on, and what he was meant to be, before he became the invulnerable zombie monster that returned from the grave via electricity, psychic powers, space travel, nanotechnology, or witchcraft. He was a guy with a sack on his head that killed teenagers with a pitchfork. Not because he was evil, but because he didn't know any better. Considering this, it's no surprise that Jason's greatest adversary was also a little boy. Tommy Jarvis was introduced in Friday the 13th, Part 4, played by Corey Feldman. This is Feldman before he ran the gauntlet of Hollywood weirdness, and he's just fantastic, as the kid that was essentially me. He's into video games and horror movies, makes his own scary masks, and he's smart. In the end, rather than simply become another one of Jason's victims, or have Jason fall into the trope of will he or won't he return, Tommy delves into Jason's psyche and makes the madman believe that he is looking at himself as a small boy. As Jason is distracted, Tommy does what all of us little kids watching these movies fantasize about doing. He picks up Jason's weapon and delivers a killing blow, saving the life of his sister. All seems fine, but as Jason makes the stereotypical final move after thought dead, Tommy goes from little boy pretending to be Jason to embracing the killer's instincts and endlessly and violently hacks away at the monster while yelling "die" over and over as his sister cries in newfound horror. This brings us to Friday the 13th, Part 5, in which we are treated to a huge jump in time, one that is still a source of argument for fans of the series. Tommy is now an 18-year-old mental patient, portrayed by 25-year-old actor John Shepard. Corey Feldman reprises the role in a nightmare sequence in the beginning of the movie. The last 6 years have been free from the physical torture that Jason inflicts on the world, but the psychological toll has been taken on Tommy, and he is only now slowly attempting to transition back into society after having been locked up after the events of the previous movie. This movie serves us up a new Jason as well, not surprisingly in the form of another parent avenging the death of their child, merely masquerading as the famous killer. The most interesting parts of the film involve seeing the little boy that Tommy Jarvis was, now as an antisocial man prone to extremely violent outbursts. This is his lowest point, and some of the best character work they've done in the series. We're not told what happened to his sister, but Tommy seems to be a person truly alone in the world. The previous movie ended with Tommy's eyes wide while hugging his sister, looking out at a potentially scary and unknown future. His frozen eyes telling us that he was now a changed child. The stage now seems so appropriately set for him to don the famous hockey mask himself that when he does at the end of Part 5, it's perfect. Tommy's eyes, wide behind the mask, once again over the shoulder of a female who trusts him. He raises a knife. There's now a new Jason, and the credits roll. But it's not the real Jason, is it? This was the sentiment that I had as a child, and that apparently most of the fans took as well. That wasn't Jason in Part 5. Just somebody dressed up as him, and that wasn't Jason at the end, it was Tommy. The original idea was that Jason was actually dead, and Tommy would continue on as Jason did after his mother died. In hindsight, that sounds like a more dramatic and poetic choice to go forward in the franchise. However, these are horror movies, so the mandate was that for Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason needed to come back from the dead. Tommy would be brought back with a complete character overhaul, essentially forgetting the events at the end of the last movie. Tommy was now a man on a mission, the hero of Camp Crystal Lake. His job was to find Jason's body and destroy it, purge it with fire, in an attempt to rid himself of the continuing fear and delusions that were still running his life. This Tommy is remarkably different from the ones we've seen prior, played by the incredible Tom Matthews, who horror fans might recognize from the Return of the Living Dead series. He's much more sure of himself, certainly more stable, but still haunted by his past. One of the more memorable scenes in the film is when Tommy, upon discovering Jason's decomposed corpse, is overcome by rage and begins his best attempt at recreating the most violent moment of his youth. This time, rather than hacking at a still living and homicidal Jason with his own machete, he's instead repeatedly stabbing a lifeless corpse with an iron rod. Dressed up as a hero he may be, but this is still just the man version of a boy who was so affected by Jason years ago. After a rather paint-by-numbers slasher flick, Tommy fulfills his destiny by sending Jason to the bottom of Crystal Lake via a rock around the killer's neck. This movie is certainly the beginning of Jason, as I didn't really enjoy him. Jason the Undead Killer. He is resurrected after lightning strikes that iron rod Tommy was stabbing him with. However, this was still before he became what pop culture started painting him as. In the very next movie, he's pitted against a girl with telekinesis, delving further into the supernatural. And one movie after that, he was taking Manhattan. Yes. Friday the 13th Part 8 is called Jason Takes Manhattan. It was then that the late 80s and early 90s painted Jason into the corner of, well, what are we going to do with this guy now? Soon enough, he was launched into space and turned into a cyborg. It was only a matter of time before he was fighting Freddy, and the entire franchise was being rebooted for modern audiences. As it goes now. So, who is Tommy Jarvis? Well, he was me. He was all of us that were huddled around an old Sylvania television, watching these movies after our parents went to bed. He was the little boy that we hoped that we all would be, the one that would defeat the monster if he broke through the door. However, he was also that very monster. When Jason Voorhees looked at little Tommy Jarvis, he thought he saw himself as a little boy. The sad truth for Jason, and ultimately for Tommy, was that that is exactly what he was. Jason became a monster because he was ill-equipped to handle the world he was thrust into. A little boy, tossed into a world of blood and death without the education, support, or love to handle that world. The same could be said for Tommy, a little boy, surrounded by death suddenly, tossed into a world he was ill-equipped to handle. Before there ever was a Freddy versus Jason, we had an even more appropriate monster versus monster battle. Tommy versus Jason. Two sides of the same coin, mirror images. More than that, though, the Ballad of Tommy Jarvis and his trilogy-long dance with Jason taught me a lesson about these movies and storytelling in general. If I were to tell someone with only a passing familiarity with Friday the 13th that there is a Shakespearean epic hidden between the lines of some of those movies, they'd likely think that I was crazy. And from their point of view, that may seem crazy. To see the high body count and discover themes like a childhood lost, to look past the naked girl gratuitously swimming in the lake and see a struggle on the duality of man, to have a blood-soaked, hockey mask-clad maniac find his mirror image and eventual defeat in a 10-year-old boy wearing glasses. It sure sounds crazy, or at the very least, it doesn't sound like the shallowness that most people probably assume about Friday the 13th. It's okay, everyone has their crazy, and none are any less valid than the next. It's entirely dependent on your own point of view and really how much you want to dig. Me, I was just having a good time watching horror movies with my friends. I was excited that when I started digging a little bit more into these movies, I found something beneath the surface. Something to cling on to. I'm glad that I did. News has recently emerged that Corey Feldman is going to reprise the role of Tommy Jarvis in Friday the 13th, Part 13. Now, me as I am today greets this with a fair amount of cynicism. Deep inside me, though, is my own personal Tommy Jarvis, huddled in his sleeping bag on the living room floor, waiting for the monster to bust through the wall. And that little boy, he cannot wait to see what happens next.